Both cameras are recording. Where are you guys? There you are. Right there. But I can tell you a AAA3 syllogism. Blah, blah, blah. Welcome. We're going to try and take a look at two of your lessons out of the intro book. So what I want to do is look at lessons 23 and 24 out of your introductory logic book with you. We are going to try to figure out what on earth is going on with these syllogisms, how we demonstrate when a syllogism is valid or invalid, which is different from saying whether it happens to contain true or untrue statements. So I'm going to try and do pretty much what we do in class. I'll read through the lesson with you right now. I'll highlight some things along the way or explain things that kind of stand out to me. And then we're just going to jump into some homework and actually try it out and see if we can come up with these things called counterexamples. Truth and Validity, lesson 23 in front of me. I'm looking at page 159 in your books. When you examine a syllogism, the first thing you should look for is validity. We say that a syllogism is valid if the conclusion is necessarily true, given that the premises are true. So right away you can see truth and validity are different things. They're not the same. Validity, in some sense, depends on truth, because what this is saying here is that if the premises are true, then we can say that the conclusion will be true, presuming the syllogism is valid. This is related to saying that, or a syllogism is valid if the conclusion is necessarily true. That is, that the conclusion has to be true given that the premises are true. So it's not the case that any two true premises always have to lead to a true conclusion. But if for some reason in the structure of the argument true premises do have to lead to a true conclusion, it must be that that syllogism is valid. As we'll see in the next lesson, what that means is that if we can show a syllogism can have true premises but go to a false conclusion, then it is not a valid syllogism. So we can demonstrate syllogisms are invalid based on how the truth or falsity of their premises and conclusions interact together. So that's what we're going to try and figure out right now. If a syllogism has true premises and a false conclusion, we know that it is invalid. So there it is. That's what I was saying a second ago. In a valid syllogism, the premises may be false. Okay, so this is key. Just because something is valid does not mean it must contain true statements. You can have a valid form and yet fill it with false statements, and maybe it would by coincidence lead to a true conclusion. Probably some of them it would lead to a false conclusion, but we just don't know. That's why it's so important to make sure that our premises are true, because when our premises are true in a valid syllogism, the conclusion has to be true. If the conclusion is not true, and yet the premises are, you know that you do not have a valid syllogism. If it sounds like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, good. I am. I'm just trying to emphasize it because this is going to end up being so important. If it doesn't yet sound to you like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, I am. But it's okay, because we're going to try and do several examples and see if we can't get this figured out. This is because validity depends on the form of the argument only. We'll talk more about this in the next lesson, but basically, remember, form has to do with the kinds of statements, A, E, I, or O, that appear in a syllogism, and where the different terms appear, the figure, right? The middle term appears first and then second, we called that figure 1. If it appears second both times, if it's the predicate of both of the premises that it appears in, we call that figure 2, and so on. It turns out that what we call validity and invalidity only depend on that form of the syllogism. It does not depend on, again, whether just by coincidence some of the statements happen to be true or happen to be false. It's all about the form. What kinds of statements are in use? Where do the terms appear? That and only that determines validity. That's why we can switch out terms, which is what we're going to be practicing in the next lesson on counterexamples, and it ends up making no difference to us. Here's an example of a valid syllogism where one of the premises happens to be false, but the syllogism remains valid. All dogs are brown animals. All poodles are dogs. Therefore, all poodles are brown animals. Now, hopefully you can recognize easily enough, it is false to say that all dogs are brown animals. That's not actually true, right? Some dogs are white. Some dogs are white with black spots. Like that's a Dalmatian, right? A Dalmatian is white with black spots. So it's not the case that all dogs are brown animals. And yet the form of this syllogism is still valid. And I want to try and demonstrate why. So first of all, let's say what the form is, right? So remember, to identify form, we first start with the kinds of statements. All dogs are brown animals. If I think about my square of opposition, where does that go? That's an A statement, right? So that's an A. All poodles are dogs. It's a different statement, but it has the same form, right? All of these statements actually are A statements. All blank are blank. So that's another A. And the conclusion, therefore, all poodles are brown animals. That's another A. And then I want to look for my middle term, right? We said the middle term was the term that appears in both of the premises, but not the conclusion. So in this case, that's dogs. And when dogs goes first and then second, or rather when the middle term goes first and then second, that's always going to end up being figure 1. And if you don't remember that, all you have to do is flip a few pages back, because right there, page 153, I think, right? Did I get that right? Yep. Page 153, we have our figure. This is one of the things I said, you just have to memorize it. When the middle term is first and then second, that's figure 1. When the middle term is second both times, figure 2. When the middle term is first both times, subject of each of the premises, that's figure 3. And when the middle term is the predicate and then the subject, that's figure 4, right? So we know, as we go back to this argument, that dogs, the middle term, appears as the subject in the major premise, and then as the predicate of the minor premise, that is, it appears first and then second. And so this has to be figure 1, right? And so is that a 1? Can you guys even tell that that's a 1? Figure 1. And so this is a triple A1 syllogism. Remember, there are 256 possible forms, but we just identified one of them, triple A1. Now, you don't know why this is yet, but I can tell you a triple A1 syllogism is valid. I can give you an example if you want. So we say something like, all dogs are mammals. All poodles are dogs. Therefore, all poodles are mammals. Now, hopefully you can tell easily enough, this is definitely the same form as this argument here, because all I've done actually is change a single term, right? I changed brown animals into mammals. And while it's not true that all dogs are brown animals, it does happen to be true that all dogs are mammals. And so really what we're saying here in the first statement is there's this group of things we call dogs. And that group of things, all of them are mammals. And so if we think of this in terms of like a Venn diagram, dogs, the circle, has to go entirely in the circle for mammals. But then in the next premise, we find out there's this new thing, and all of them belong to the first thing we talked about, the dogs, right? So I could actually zoom in here, and I could say, oh, but there's this thing in here, poodles, right? And all the poodles belong to the dogs. So by definition, presuming my premises are true here, of course, if all the poodles belong to all the dogs, and then all the dogs belong to all the mammals, of course, the poodles that are way inside here also belong to this larger group of mammals. Now again, that is valid argumentation. That is a valid argument whether or not my statements happen to be true. The problem when we saw that argument down here was not with the form of the syllogism or the way we were making our argument. The problem was that one of our premises just wasn't true. It's not true that in this group, dogs, all of them belong to this larger group of brown animals, because not all dogs are brown animals. So again, I just want to be really clear here. This is definitely a valid form. AAA1 is valid. But if I happen to use a false premise, I'm not going to know whether the conclusion is true or false. It could be either. Definitely happens to be false here. Not all poodles are brown animals. But there are other scenarios where we could just randomly run into a true conclusion. But that would really just be about luck. It's only when we have true premises combined with this valid form that we can know for sure we have a valid and true syllogism, which, as we'll learn in a moment, is called a sound syllogism. All right. If it were in fact true that all dogs were brown, then all poodles would necessarily be brown. The problem with the syllogism is the falsehood of the first premise, not the structure of the argument. To test for validity, grant provisional truth to the premises, and then see if the conclusion would have to be true. So what that just means is one way we can try and figure out if a form is valid is we can say, well, whether or not the premises are actually true, let's pretend they are. And if we pretend they're true, and the conclusion based on them would also have to be true, then that's a valid syllogism. But if we can pretend that the premises are true, and yet it does not lead us to a conclusion that is also true, then that's not a valid syllogism. And we'll do that more with counterexamples in the next lesson. Here's an example of an invalid syllogism with all true premises and a true conclusion. So this is almost the opposite of what we just looked at. We just looked at a AAA1, which is like the gold standard for syllogisms. It is definitely valid. And yet, because we had a false premise, all dogs are not brown animals, it turns out we got to a conclusion that was not true. In this case, we're going to see the opposite. All of these statements are true, but the form of this argument is going to turn out to be invalid. So first of all, let's say what that form is. All dogs are mammals. All dogs are canines. Therefore, all canines are mammals. Well, again, if I'm thinking about the statements themselves, they're all A statements, right? So this is another AAA syllogism. But this time, dogs, my middle term, appears as the subject in both premises. When the middle term appears first both times, we call that figure 3. And again, the only way I know that is that I have memorized this table on page 153. When the middle term is first both times, when it is the subject of each of the premises, that is figure 3. So let's come back here where we left off, and let's say, okay, so this is a AAA 3 syllogism. We don't have a reason or not to know this yet, but I can tell you a AAA 3 syllogism is not valid. And actually, I am going to go ahead and give you a reason right now. This argument, everything happens to be true. All dogs are mammals, that's true. All dogs are canines, that's also true. Therefore, all canines are mammals. But let's say that I were to just slightly change the argument. Let's say I adjusted it just a little bit. And I'm going to rewrite it using, in a few cases, just different terms, but I'm keeping the form of the argument the same. I'm going to say all cats are mammals. So obviously the only thing I'm changing here is I'm switching from dogs to cats, right? All cats, because I want that middle term to appear first both times, just like it did over here. All cats are animals. That's also a true statement, right? But if I keep this conclusion, it would lead me to believe, notice where canines appears, right? It's where animals is in my new argument. All animals are mammals. And that turns out not to be true. So in this case, I can see a true premise and a true premise led to a false conclusion. Again, in the next lesson, that's going to be really important. Every time we see a true, false situation, we must be looking at an invalid syllogism. Whether it happens to contain true statements or not has nothing to do with it. If we can make true premises lead to a false conclusion, that is an invalid syllogism every single time. When we say a first statement like, all dogs are mammals, again, we mean something like, there's this group of things, dogs, and it belongs to this bigger group, mammals. But then if we say that that same group, dogs, also belongs to another group, like canines, well, it could be that the canines fit like that. In which case, yeah, the argument ends up working, right? All canines are mammals. And again, that happens to be true in this particular case. But it could just as easily be a situation where, like, all dogs are canines out here. And then it's not the case that all the canines are mammals, because there are all these canines out here that end up not being mammals. Now, again, that's not true with canines and mammals, but it could be true. In fact, that's exactly what ended up happening in our cats example, right? So we said, all right, so let's switch, and let's say all cats are mammals, which is true, but then it's also true that all cats are animals. But animals, obviously, is a larger group than mammals. Now, I just happen to know that already, which is how I end up knowing that the statements down here are true, true, and then false. But the question is, what if I didn't know whether the statements are true or false? That's where validity and invalidity end up helping me. Because if I know my premises happen to be true, and I know I'm dealing with a valid form, I can rely on the fact that the conclusion is true, logically speaking, without having to know its actual truthhood or falsity or anything like that. So this is what we're trying to get to. We want to be able to take advantage of the fact that in logic, you might not know whether statements are true or false, but you can always know whether a given form is valid or invalid. I guess let's pick up here. Once a syllogism has been examined for validity and it is found to be valid, it may then be examined with a view toward the truth or falsehood of the conclusion. If the syllogism is invalid, then there is no reason to proceed any further. But if it is found to be valid, it's still necessary to examine the truth of the premises. If they are found to be true, then the conclusion must be true as well. In other words, if you're examining a syllogism, if you can tell that it's invalid by whatever means, whether the counterexamples we look at in lesson 24 or this thing we're going to learn about later on called testing out syllogisms by rules, if you can tell it's invalid, then true premises, you just don't know what they lead to. Maybe they lead to a true conclusion. Sometimes they lead to a false conclusion. So you know you can stop there. You just can't rely on anything. So you can't use it to draw any kind of valid conclusion. But if it turns out you're dealing with a valid form, then you become very interested in whether or not the premises are also true, because true premises plus a valid form must lead to a true conclusion. And that's what you can see in the next paragraph they call sound. If a syllogism is valid and the premises are true, it is said to be sound. You should realize then that the conclusion of a sound syllogism must be true. Do not confuse truth with validity. Once we learn the basic rules of formal logic, it is easy to see how prevalent this confusion is. In public debate, the applause is frequently reserved not for those who reason well, but for those with whom the audience agrees. Here is a final example where the premises are true and the conclusion is necessarily true. All dogs are mammals. True, right? All poodles are dogs. Also true. Therefore, all poodles are mammals. Now, not only do we know that these statements are true, but as we think about the form of this argument, AAA mood, right? And what's my middle term? I can see mammals. No, what am I doing? I can see dogs first and then second. And remember, that is once again figure 1. So this is a AAA1 syllogism. That's definitely a valid form. This syllogism is valid and the premises are true, so the conclusion is also true. In fact, it could say the conclusion has to be true. This is what we call a sound syllogism. Truth and validity are not the same thing, but when an argument is both true, or its various statements are true, and its form is valid, that's what we call a sound syllogism. The different types of syllogisms with respect to validity and truth can thus be arranged as shown. An argument can be either valid or invalid, and only valid arguments can be either sound or unsound, depending on whether their premises are true. Sound means premise equals true. Unsound means premise equals false. So this ended up actually being a little bit longer than I wanted, so I'm probably going to split this into its own video. I hope that was helpful thinking through just lesson 23, the difference between truth and validity. Make sure to comment down below with any questions you have. I'm happy to look at those comments and try and answer questions you have. There should be another video. You can probably click somewhere on this page to find out all about Lesson 24, Testing Syllogisms by Counterexample.